Today on Paul's Old Crap, what we're going to do is replace the capacitors in an LC power supply. There's a few different models that the LC's shipped with. I've recapped, I think, 4 different PSUs already. I think there was actually maybe only 3 different vendors. So we've got one here that says Dyna Comp on it. Yeah, I don't know. I think I got a couple of these ones, and this one here is the Aztec. A couple of these ones. I think most of the ones that I have are the TDK ones. So what we're going to do today is recap the Aztec one. Now they're very similar power supplies. The actual capacitors that are used between these will differ between the vendors. I did make a list as I went through them, but then of course one thing to keep in mind is revisions of the model number might have different capacitors. So really the only way you're going to know for sure what you need is to open the thing up and then read the values on all the capacitors. That's what I did first, and then I placed my order for capacitors. So yeah, anyway, I've got all the stuff I need now. So what we're going to do is just basically go through my steps for recapping these. One thing I will point out before we get started though, I am not a professional at this. I never really learned to solder properly. I just kind of watched some YouTube videos and then trial and error basically. So don't take anything I say in this video as like fact. It's mainly just how I've been able to go through the soldering job, and all of the ones that I've recapped still work. Nothing's caught on fire, nothing's blown up, so I'm probably not that bad at it. But that being said, yeah, there's probably better ways to do some things, so just keep that in mind. But anyway, to get started, let's just go through what we need. So when it comes to actually desoldering the capacitors that are in there right now, I use this wick braid stuff. Basically, you just place it on the existing solder, warm it up with your iron, and it just kind of like absorbs it all. I don't know why I went with this over something like one of those desoldering guns, which uses like suction to suck the solder up. I think this was basically just because a lot of the work I was doing was on surface mount. Not all the time was I working on like through-hole capacitors or whatever the hell, if that's even the proper name. So, but yeah, anyway, this works out, so whatever. The actual solder I used, I have no idea what I'm supposed to be using. This is just 22 gauge. Yeah, this is just whatever I found that was a decent deal on DigiKey, so yeah. When it comes to flux for putting components or the new solder on the board, for these power supplies, I find that the gel type flux is much more convenient, well, for me, than the liquid type. I was using this pen that you dab on the boards, and it's liquid flux, I guess, and I use that for recapping motherboards usually, but for the power supplies, I find this gel stuff works pretty good. So let's see what else you might need. You might need some alcohol. This is not the kind you drink, because if you drink this, you are going to get messed up pretty bad. What you do with this is you use it maybe with Q-tips, and you clean the contacts that, well, when you pull the old capacitors off these, sometimes they're going to be leaking like the electrolyte or whatever the hell out onto the board. And in cases where the power supply is already dead, I've pulled the caps and there's been a lot of leakage, and I had to clean it all up and then put the new capacitors in, and that actually revived the power supply. So when you get that leakage that's coming out of the old capacitors, it is like conductive material, so when it bridges the contacts in the power supply, then, you know, just nothing works. So when you're pulling your old caps, if you do see leakage on the board, get some Q-tips, and if it's bad leakage, yeah, use alcohol to clean it up. I think technically you probably should also use something to counteract the chemical. That might be something like vinegar, but I'm not a chemist. I have no idea. I've just been using Q-tips and sometimes the alcohol if it's really dirty. And that seems good enough. All the boards that I've redone have worked, so yeah. Disassembly of the power supply, just a couple of Phillips head screwdrivers. I think that's all you need. And what I also use is needle nose pliers when I'm actually pulling the capacitors out, because some of these are a little harder to reach with just your fingers. The LC power supply is actually very easy to work on compared to some of the other ones I've done, so yeah, you might not need to use these all the time, but yeah, if the capacitor doesn't just fall out by itself, I like to use pliers. And then I also have these little snipper things for when I'm removing the leads on the new capacitor after they've been installed. So, yeah. What we will do now is jump into disassembly of the power supply. Alright, so there's not a whole lot of screws that hold this together. I think I actually loosened these already. So basically just one up there. Yeah, this one's already loose, and I've just dropped it all over the place. We'll just move that out of sight, pretend that didn't happen. The other one, I think I'll use this one. I think it's, yeah, screw that's right there. All right, put that up to the side. I think that has actually enough to remove the lid. Yeah. So this part here, you just kind of pull upward, and then it's got, what does it do? This side of it, I think, is a bit tricky. Okay, yeah, there was some weird little hinge part that was right in there, so, and then you can be careful when you reinstall, make sure these are secure properly. So okay, inside the power supply you do have a screw that looks like it's for the ground. Let's see if I can get this out. It's got these little pain in the ass washers on the screw. You know what? I think I'll just leave the screw in the wire. It's already disconnected from the frame, so that's fine. This screw here on the side, this holds, there's like a piece of aluminum that's being used as a heat sink inside there, so I'll just pull this out. Losing my screws all over the place. There is actually one more screw that's right in here. Come on. Stay there. Alright, let's... Oh, it looks like it's working. And the plastic bits will remove the metal casing. And we now have the power supply removed. So basically what we're going to replace is all of these capacitors over here, as well as there's also one down in here, and this big sucker is also being replaced. Now, you might not have to replace all of these in order to repair a power supply, but I don't really feel like doing this job more than once, so every capacitor in here, I did order these, so I'm going to replace all of them. Yeah, might as well get another like 10 or 20 years out of this thing, maybe, unless one of these other components blows up, so yeah. Anyway, what we're going to do now is I'm going to warm up the soldering iron. What I'm using is Now, this is just like your bottom of the barrel $15 budget soldering iron. Like, it literally says the brand is best with a bunch of like Asian characters underneath it. So, yeah, this is like, it probably cost China like $2 or less to manufacture this thing. So, what I'm going to do now is basically just pause the video, get the iron warmed up, and we will start to desolder the old capacitors. Alright, so we're almost ready to go. I've actually gone through and got all of the capacitors out that I will need. When it comes to how you pick the capacitors on the old one, you see the value is like 180 and then this weird looking U and F. I forget what that actually is supposed to mean, but that's the like capacitance kind of thing, so that's the number that matters. The voltage rating, when you're picking up a new capacitor, the voltage should be exactly the same, or if it's above it, that is also fine. Well, I mean, what I do is I try to get the exact same ones, but there's been cases where a capacitor, I've had to get the higher, like a little bit higher rating voltage on the new capacitor because I couldn't order the exact one, and it still works out just fine. But generally, your capacitor will increase in size, I think, as the rated voltage goes up. So that might be a problem for some tight fits like in here. But yeah, anyway, so I've picked up pretty much the exact same capacitor that's already in there. The brand that I go for, it's like, I guess it's either Nishikon or Nichicon or who knows how the hell you say it. I don't know. That's typically what you will find in a lot of these power supplies in the first place. The real crappy ones will have like no brand. It'll just say long life on them, and those ones will be the worst leaking ones. I don't know if that's in this particular power supply, but yeah. So for the capacitor brands, that's basically what I buy. You can also buy Panasonics. I think those are also fairly high rated. I think it's about the same price, or maybe even a little more expensive than these ones, so I just went with those. And you will also need, I forgot to mention this, what I do is I use just like paper towel that I've like run it through the under the tap so it's wet, and then I can just clean the tip of my soldering iron off there. All right, and I think it's time to get down and remove some capacitors. So the first one that we're going to do is that big sucker there. So I don't really do this in a very scientific way. I just kind of look at where it's placed on the board, and then when you flip it over, you make a best guess judgment call as to where the leads are, which in this case, well, they're right there because there's nothing else around it. I mean, that's pretty obvious. So on my soldering iron, I have it set to the second highest setting. That's what I use for desoldering. I set it a bit lower for actual soldering. That's just basically from my own experience. I don't know if there's any specific setting you're supposed to use, but yeah, anyway, I take my soldering braid crap. What I do is I just kind of like place the braid like actually on the solder, and then I just try to lay the iron across it, and eventually the solder starts to liquefy, and I might try to move this around a bit to try and help it suck all of the old stuff up. And if we look at it, we only got like half of it so far. That's not good enough, so we'll move the braid down a bit. Place the iron over here. Kind of move it around. Almost clear. I think that one is, yeah, That's not looking too bad, I think. So now what we do is we move on to the second lead. Super annoying having to look up at my video camera while I'm doing this so I can see that the work is in frame. Come on. Sometimes when I do this, my face is a lot closer to the board, and I really inhale all of these fumes that are coming off this thing. Yeah, it's real good. We're almost there. It's not as clean as I prefer. Okay, there we go. I think that's good. So, yeah, that probably should be okay to remove. What I try to do is memorize the polarity. So on this one, this line here is the negative. So the negative faces this transformer looking thing. So we can just pull the old capacitor out. And if we look underneath it, I don't think this is leaking anything. So yeah, this probably still had a decent amount of life left in it, maybe. But I think these things break down internally over time, just the nature of chemistry, I think. So if we look at the board, it doesn't look like we need to do any cleaning. There kind of looks like something there, but that's not really a big deal, I don't think. Anyway, it'll also tell you, so we've got a little plus sign up there. So that's how you know your positive's up there and your negative's down that way. We take the new capacitor. And when you're buying these capacitors, these really large ones will have these kind of like hook-looking ends for most of these power supplies. I think the only one I've had that uses just like the actual smaller lead might be the 2SI power supply that I've done so far. I can't remember. But yeah, the LC power supplies, they all have this, like, it's called like a snap connector. I don't really remember. Anyway, this one you just kind of like line it up a bit, and then it just kind of like sticks in, and when you look back, you've got the leads there. What I do to make it stay in place is I bend these down a bit. So I just take like my set of pliers and try to carefully push it down. Because if you do this without care, you might destroy your trace, and then that would be silly. So I just kind of hold the capacitor with my other finger here, and then I push that down a bit so it kind of helps it stay in place, because I'm not going to do the soldering on this until after I've replaced all the capacitors. So I don't want this falling out every time I flip the board over. So I think that worked out. If you take a look, I've just bent the pins down a little bit there. So, yeah, it's not going to fall out. Anyway, let's take a look at some other capacitors. If we jump over to the other end of it, we've got these big suckers over here. So, we have, we'll do this one next. This one is right next to this weird coil looking thing. I don't know what the hell that's called, so yeah. But if we look at the alignment on this one, The negative is down on that side. We flip it over. Logically, that would probably mean these two ones right in here. And because the negative is on like a vertical something or other, what the hell the word I'm looking for, I don't know, that means, yeah, it would line up with these two leads here. So, let's do those ones. And it was these ones right in here. So because these are smaller, it should go faster. It's bubbling away. And I think that one is pretty much good. Yeah. All right. So then we do the other end of the capacitor. And I think that one is also good. Let's take a look. And what we're going to do is use our pliers to gently pull this out. There we go. So we've removed this capacitor, and we'll make a note of what this is. So this is the 1200 and 10 volt. So when we look at the capacitors I have sitting around, that's the 16 volt. This is the 1200 10 volt. Physically, they are a bit different. They're still tall capacitors, but the new ones are actually not as large. So, yeah. There's so many different options for when you're buying these. So when it comes to the LC power supplies, I generally go for the taller capacitors, because otherwise if you get ones that are wider but not tall, you're going to have some serious trouble getting them to fit inside here, because it gets pretty tight. So anyway, I don't know if you'll be able to see this very well. If we look at inside on the board, I don't think it was leaking. That might just be like old school flux still sitting around in there. However, what we're going to do is just pull out one of our Q-tips, and let's just rub it around in there a bit. Yeah, so it looks like it was, I don't think there's anything actually on this Q-tip. If there was leaking capacitor crap all over the place, this would come out looking like brown. So in this case, I don't think there was any leakage on this capacitor, and this power supply was still working. So yeah, these weren't, I don't think, at the point of absolute failure yet. Anyway, so we've got our new capacitor, which was the 1200 and the 10 volt. Just make sure the leads are not bent completely, so it'll slide in. We remember our polarity, and if we look at the board here, there's a little tiny plus that's in there. I don't know how well you'll be able to see it, but the plus is on the upper side of it because the negative was at the lower side of it. So I just kind of line that up and then push the capacitor all the way down. Then I flip it over, and what I do is I just kind of bend the leads so they're kind of out of the way like that. And I don't do the soldering until after I've replaced all the capacitors. So yeah, that's the new one now installed. So I think what I'm going to do is going to skip ahead until I've got all the capacitors replaced, and then we'll cover the actual soldering process. This video is probably already going to be fairly long, so instead of having it be like actually 2 hours, I'm going to try and cut it down as much as possible. From start to finish, I think it takes me about 1 hour or so to recap one of these. and that's when I'm not trying to improvise a bunch of random facts about soldering at the same time. So, yeah. Okay, so I've got all the capacitors replaced. You can see all of the new leads pointing off in random directions, so the capacitors themselves stay seated, all nice and shiny in there. What we're going to do first is get the soldering done on the first capacitor that we did. So, to do that, what I've got is my gel flux, and I'm just going to put a bunch on the contact and around the base. Now, I don't bother with doing full cleaning of the base where the leads come out of. When you heat the flux up, I think it kind of acts like a cleaning agent as well. So as you're heating up the flux and putting your solder down, it looks like it's already cleaning the contact as well. And I've never had any problem with just soldering right over the previous. Well, I mean, generally the old solder is mostly gone in the first place when you're using your desoldering, but yeah, I've never really had to do any extra cleaning on this side of the board. Usually the only problems I encounter are when you've got leaking capacitors on this side. So what I've got on my soldering iron is I've set it to the middle-ish setting, which I think was like 380 Fahrenheit. I don't know if that's a setting I'm supposed to be using for this, but it seems to work out decently for me. So we're going to lay the solder down. It's going to be tricky to make sure you can actually see what I'm doing here. What I do is I just kind of place the tip of the iron to try and contact both the base and the new contact, or the new lead from the capacitor. And then I just, come on. Move the solder in. Let's see if I can. I think that actually worked out pretty good. If it doesn't look like it flowed properly, I think what you could do is like hold the iron down on the solder and then just wait until it all liquefies and I don't know, try to reflow it again, move it around a bit. I don't know. If it doesn't look like it's a good contact, definitely play around with it a bit. So let's move on to the second leg here. I'll just kind of put the iron right in there and get my solder going. And let's take a look. Yeah, I think that one actually went pretty good as well. It gets a bit trickier with the smaller leads, so there's this one that's right in here. So that one, that's a very small capacitor. That's that one there. So let's try that one. I'm going to, let's see, put down a bunch of the flux. In a case like this, using an even smaller smaller gauge solder might be better, but yeah, this stuff, it seems to be fine for what I'm doing. You can see what I'm doing here. I'll just kind of like place my iron there. And this one you don't want to use that much solder because it's a very small contact. I think that is probably enough to do the job, on that side anyway. let's try the second side. Yeah, sometimes I might use a bit more solder than that on the second one, but I don't think we need to do that in this case. I think it should be okay. Let's see. I'm going to move on to one of the larger capacitors. This is the first one of this cluster here that we desoldered. It was this one that was right next to this weird coil-looking thing. So let's put the solder down on there. So get our flux, drop a bunch there. All right, and heat that up. Lay down the solder. Let's take a look at it. That should be fine. Yeah, looks good. Sometimes I might even use more than that, but it looks like that will be okay. And let's get the other side of it. Let's clean the iron. And heat that up. And let's take a look. Yeah, so that second one, was that one there. I think that looks good enough. This goes a lot easier when I'm not trying to film it because I'm noticing my hand is a little shaky because I'm having to lean back out of the way of my camera while I'm doing this, where normally I would actually be like hunched over the desk. So what you're seeing here is not even as precise as I can normally do this job, so it should still work fine though. But anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to complete the rest of the joints. I'm not going to bother recording it though, because that will just make this a super long video. After I've done all the soldering, I'll just show how I clip the leads off, and then we'll just go from there. So yeah, we'll pick this up in a little bit. All right, so I've finished the soldering job. I think it probably looks decent. I'll say again, I'm not a professional. I just kind of learned to do this by teaching myself, so yeah. Anyway, so now we need to get rid of all of these leads. So what I do is I take my snips, and you have to be very careful with this because you don't want to actually scratch the traces on the board when you're doing this. So this might be difficult for me to really show on the camera, but just very lightly place it. There you go. There's one. Those ones in there. Looks fine. Another thing that I was doing, if you bend these back and forth enough, they'll also just break off, but I kind of wanted to do a cleaner look by using the cutters. So basically you just do that and you remove all of the leads. So I will skip ahead until all of this is done and we're ready to reassemble it. Okay, so I've got all of the leads clipped off, and now I think you can just leave the rest of this as is. If you really want to try and clean some of the flux off, what I have here is like an old toothbrush. Dip it in my isopropyl alcohol, and let's just see, it's a bunch of other flux that's on there already. Disgusting crap. So if you really want to do this, you can just basically brush the board with your alcohol. This might actually just end up spreading the flux more around on the board. So the end result is that the rest of the underside will just be really sticky from the flux, depending on what you used. In terms of electrical conductivity, I don't think there's any problem if you were to just leave the board as is. But I kind of wanted to clean this up visually, because the flux leaves a bit of a mess on the underside of the board, and I didn't really want that. So, ugh. So I don't know. It's cleaned up a little bit. There's still going to be a bunch of flux all over the place, and yeah, if I touch the board, I can kind of feel it's got that stickiness to it. So there's still going to be flux on the board. It's not perfectly clean, but for usability, that's not really a big deal. And now that that's done, you can just take a peek through the soldering you did. Make sure it looks okay. Nothing horribly wrong. I think we are probably okay. So, we are ready to reassemble. Now, this is the fun part, because sometimes when I take things apart, I forget how to reassemble them. So I remember this was the bottom piece, and this has these two little spots there, which is where these plastic bits go. So this is an indication that I am on the right track. This sat somewhere in here, like this. Okay, we'll deal with those plugs in a minute. And we're not going to fully tighten it just yet. I want to look underneath. That looks about normal, so we'll roll with that. Before I tighten that down, I am going to install the screw that was holding this heat shield type stuff here. So that's right in there, because I need this to kind of line up in the hole properly. Get that decently tight without stripping it, and then we tighten the one that was, come on. Okay, that is locked in place. If we look over here, this was the ground screw. So we will do this while we are in here. Perfect. And these pieces just kind of sat loose in there for now until we get the lid on there. So I believe that is good. All right, lid piece. This thing has the hinged thingy-majig there. So this is the one that went on this side. This is a bit of a pain in the ass. I think you have to push these out slightly. Get that lined up in there. Is this lining up properly, or am I missing? 'Cause yeah, trying to figure out how these things went back together, and it's like, I don't remember. Oh, there we go. So it's just a matter of figuring out which metal overlaps which. Super annoying. Okay, so anyway, these plastic parts are nice and locked in place. That leaves us with 2 screws left. This one here is the threaded one, so we will use this screw. Make sure it's tight and hopefully not strip the screw. And the last one we have here is the screw down there that holds the case in. And I do have this one last lock washer thing. Alright. Assuming this is the proper one. I think so. Alright. The power supply is now reassembled, and we're going to well, I'm going to let this just kind of like dry off on the inside for a little bit. I want all of the any residual isopropyl alcohol to just evaporate off there, and then I will throw this into the LC computer and we'll test it out. Alright, so what I've got here is the LC475. I believe this is the unit that the power supply came out of originally. I did have them stacked up, so I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, we're going to install the power supply, and hopefully it works. Power supply installs insanely easily. It basically just snaps in place, and then the power plug lines up. This is one of the first computers that I was doing my recapping on, so I've just got like radial capacitors in here because I wasn't sure how skilled I was going to end up at this, so it still works though. Anyway, plug in our power, and moment of truth. Ready? Look, it works, and it didn't blow up. Excellent. So yeah, that is how you recap the Macintosh LC power supply. It is probably one of the easiest power supplies to recap. I've done a bunch of other types now, Power Mac 9500, bunch of other types of power supplies, and this one is by far the easiest to do. Yeah. So anyway, if you've got an LC, I recommend you recap the power supply. These are all going to start leaking soon, so you might as well get it done. Yeah, it's easy enough to do if you're not sure about your soldering skills. I'm new at it myself, and as you can see, I was able to do it successfully. So yeah, anyway, I guess thank you for watching.